Okay, I guess we are running. Let's get our little show on. Welcome to Evolution Hour and the wonderful analog devices that belong to my upbringing as an ancient person. And remember the WordPress.com website, a lot of stuff there. Freebie, share away. Okie doke. And we will stop sharing that little puppy. Another hot day here in Spokane and an exciting weekend politically, which we're not going to go into until we see how more dust settles as to who is doing what to whom and why. That important part we will comment upon as need be. Anyway, as you well know, we are plowing down source by bloody source through the creationist book Titans, which is not exactly the most astonishingly well-documented book on dinosaurs I've ever seen. Most of it is simply retreading the apologetics of creationism and more specifically Creation Ministries International creationism, which of course Sarfati and Tay are closely connected with. So that's a yawner. Every once in a while, as you've noticed the last couple of weeks, there are some taxa that come up that they neglect to offer references for, and that piques my curiosity. And this is another one of those. So we've got a name I'm going to be slaughtering the pronunciation of. Futalognkosaurus, I think is kind of close, and a few others, for which there's no references at all. We're still talking sauropods. Some of these things have fairly well represented fossils. Other examples have very sparsely indicated fossils, and there's a up and down, in and out as to why they are being brought on the scene as well. They, of course, assigned them to a type, titanosaurids typically, and that. But there's systematic murkiness going on here that make you wonder why they're assigning them to what they are, and are they simply following certain older paleontology, not paying attention to newer stuff. So anyway, we got this very large Patagonian sauropod, Futalognkosaurus, from a paper, but they cite a paper that's not on that one at all, but on a pterosaur, Kellner 2017. And I'll be putting a link up to that whole thing. It's open access. In no sense is it a relevant citation for that dinosaur. It just alludes to that along the way. Their authors had done work on this, fine and dandy, but it's really far down the road, which makes me wonder why they just didn't cite the 2000 from Calvo on it, and I will be putting a link up to that so you can read it too. And I think it's because the paper was about the entire ecosystem. That yes, it was a detailed systematic of the fossil, what they had available on it, but also the environment in which it lived and how it died and how it played a part in the deposits that they were having. Because Sarfati and Tay allude to the fact that they found pterosaurs there and they found some fish and all that, which they just dangle as if we are supposed to understand what's going on. Well, in the Calvo 2007 paper, that's all explained quite nicely, which could account for why Sarfati and Tay didn't want to go out of their way to bring the attention of the reader to information that isn't fitting their model. The deposit that this fossil was from, this big sauropod, and it was a big sauropod, was 1/2 meter slice, which is really thin, like that, of siliclastic alluvial facies in the quarry that, quote, representing a time span in the scale of years, unquote, and reflecting a, quote, wide meandering river system, unquote, alternating flooding and dry seasons. This is not a big slosh scenario. This is not an ecology that is cataclysmically overturned and fabulously preserved fossils are dumped down. No, these are more your bits and pieces of stuff showing up fossils, which is what you get in the actual normal world. Anyway, from that 2007 paper, was quite a long quote that I'm going to be hopefully being able to continue to stick into the main references, depending on how we are on length. And I will read it to you here. Regarding the remains of Futalognkosaurus, Dilophosaurus dukei, we hypothesize that it died of unknown causes on a floodplain near the margins of a river. The carcass was possibly partially dismembered by theropod dinosaurs present in this area, such as Megaraptor and small dromaeosaurids, and perhaps also some crocodylomorphs like peirosaurids. A short time after its death, a single flooding event of great intensity washed the carcass of this giant sauropod dinosaur into the river channel. That, by the way, would be the closest that you could have gotten to the big slosh bit, but it's what happens in the rest of the paragraph that means no, that's not what we're talking about here. Due to its giant size, the carcass likely acted as a barrier, reducing the competency of the currents generated by subsequent smaller flooding events that are very common in the wet seasons. This resulted in the deposition of additional organic remains around this huge carcass. By the way, I'll point out that the carcass involved not having any of the legs preserved. It's basically the main part of the body, a good section of the neck, a bit of the tail. So it's that big hunky part that's got the main bones, but the other stuff presumably was gnawed on and dealt with prior to its arrival in the flooding event to form what was happening. To continue. At some point, the river changed its course laterally, leaving an oxbow lake behind. Surprisingly, some tiny fish skeletons were found together with the dinosaur elements. Since they are complete, the only explanation for their presence along with the large bones is that they were trapped when this lake was formed. The few bivalves preserved in the same horizon were trapped too. Unquote. So we have an ecosystem, we have a perfectly natural set of events that are not big slosh cataclysm, and we have to wonder, did Sarfati tiptoe far enough down the road to be even aware of this Calvo 2007 paper? I think it's entirely possible they weren't, that they were just riffing off of the 2017 work that they came upon by whatever means. Hard to tell. Anyway, the next little miscellaneous taxon they put up is Dromaeosaurus or Rebeccasauridae. Some technical papers they did not cite on the only 80% preserved one that is alluded to peripherally in Sarfati and Tay and on the Wikipedia page. There's Calvo 1995 and Salgado 2004. There's links to that. I only bring these in because the only reason that Rebeccasaurids are deemed to be the family of this Dromaeosaurus is from improved fossil finds, though still very fragmentary. Most of the ones are not that magnificent 80% one. In fact, that 80% fossil is no indication that it is formed in catastrophic circumstances either. Anyway, the forms were initially pegged as derived diplodocids, which underscores that is it because Sarfati and Tay are parasitizing, in this case, more recent paleontology work, that they are assigned by those paleontologists to this separate family and therefore deemed to be a separate kind based on that parasitism. Needless to say, we don't get any detailed analysis in the creationist literature as to why they're doing anything they are. Same thing that goes for the Ark encounter, which of course is why it comes up in rocks too. Now to the exciting world of part 2, which is a creationist player by a new player on the scene, someone named Graham Taylor. And I had not encountered this little fellow before, so I was kind of intrigued as to what kind of background he was doing. But this paper is kind of interesting. It's on marsupials in Australia, an act of God. And it came up in regards also to a Joel Duff video, which I'll be putting a link to as well. So first, the skivvy. Taylor says the quiet part out loud, that he concedes that there are problems facing creationist attempts to provide a naturalistic justification for the odd prevalence of marsupials in Australia after the flood. And he flings open the door for miraculous guidance and preferential protection as they scamper off of the Ark and make it to Australia. But along the way, Taylor does some deck stacking and relies mainly on a fellow Statham, Dominic Statham, on his spin on evolutionary accounts on biogeography. I'll be putting a link up to that little puppy too. Biogeography, as you know. Oh, hi, Purple. Biogeography, as one knows, is a topic that is not exactly tremendously fond in anti-evolution circles, and because it supports evolutionary contexts. You get a few defenders of the status quo. Casey Luskin was terribly fond of banging this drum, and Gunter Beckley has picked up the Luskin cudgel as well. But they're basically banging the same stuff over and over again. And one of the things that Statham riffed off of was this 2005 paper by De Quiros, which I'll be putting a link up to so you can read it, which you can use to compare the spin that Statham gives to it as opposed to the details in the De Quiros paper that is talking about various dispersal mechanisms for the relatively rare exceptions to the overall dynamics of biogeography that we can see because of plate tectonics. There are always a few little squiggly ends as to, well, gosh, how did they get to be where they are based on things? And sometimes some can even involve oceanic dispersals, especially if they're relatively small, which those little fiddly bit details tend to get left out in the discussion. But the bigger elephant in the room on this whole biogeography thing and the differential preferential survival of marsupials relates to Joel Duff's little breakdown that creationists are putting up this astonishing hypothesis. Oh, did the calculation itself for sloths to swim in the Middle East back to South America take about 40 years at their top speed? Yeah. It would be hilarious to see creationists try to comprehensively catalog all the various kinds they have on their ark and seriously attempt to work out the scenarios by which they get to their destinations. And likewise, people. But one of the topics that's going to be in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There has to do with how dismally bad they are on trying to account for human dispersal and how parochial and limited it is. And the deal that they're dealing with animal life is just exactly as bad. A bigger non-elephant in the room is one that I will put in on top of Joel Duff's criticisms at this point. Taylor imagines that God needs to keep predation and competition from munching by placental mammals. He has to keep them at bay during the post-flood dispersal. And that gave away his conceptual failures because he... Dinosaurs? Weren't there dinosaurs on hand after the flood? Aren't they insisting dinosaurs survived and dispersed again? Where did they go? The creationist lexicon had dinosaurs being in China, stegosaurs being in sauropods and such, traipsing around to be killed by St. George as dragons. And they've got marine reptiles and pterosaurs flipping around in the New World, and some of them go overboard and are still trying to argue that some of these things are surviving down into modern times. We'll be cataloging the discussions of all of that stuff eventually later. Oh, yes, there we go. I like that. Yeah, I'm actually surprised that some of them haven't thought of an idea that harebrained. But yes, by all means, let somebody follow up on the idea that they were using whale ubers and various, well, not only that, whale sharks. You've got the larger plesiosaurs that have quite large maws. Oh, wow, could you just see some cute little marsupial inside there with its little nest as the obliging sea monster before it gets destroyed as Leviathan ferries them across to Australia, which is rapidly moving away from where it was during Pangea. Remember, there's all of this stuff happening simultaneously. The creationist model at the AIG Ark Encounter world is that the pre-flood world was the Rodinia supercontinent, and that somewhere during or immediately after the flood, Pangea collides and forms. and that quickly after converging into the form that we know in our conventional geology. And mountain ranges are being thrown up, and of course waters of the deep are being shuffled downhill, and you've got ginormous deposits of mega sequences all over the place, and all of this is happening all at once. And it's just a misplaced concreteness that is never going to work. The analogy that I used in one of the old writings in TIP, I can't remember whether it was in chapter 4 or chapter 3. You can download that from the old work, and related to the Empire State Building and where it is in New York City. And Empire State Building happens to exist on the same site as the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The one that's currently in New York was built after that in the 1920s and when it moved uptown. But the Waldorf Astoria is where the old Astor mansions were way back in the day when they moved up in their nice little spot at the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue. And so Caroline Astor had her mansion there, and her cousin, the Backhouse Astors, had that bunch, their mansion right next door. And William Waldorf Astor inherited the house next door when his father died, and he detested his Aunt Caroline. And so he tore his house down because by then things were changing, and there was a move to move a lot of the big wealthy houses farther uptown so they get farther away from the hoi polloi. And yes, but the Waldorf is the only one that is memorialized as a salad. Yeah, there. Well, in a way, our Davenport Hotel, the Shrimp Louis, it was created by Louis Davenport of the Davenport Hotel here in Spokane, although there have been some chefs over in Seattle that have attempted to co-opt it and say that they developed it first. Patooey upon you. No. That's Louis Davenport at the Davenport Hotel. Although a lot of people use Thousand Island dressings and stuff, for their Shrimp Louis and that elsewhere. But the original, if you want the original, you can come to Spokane and eat at the Palm Court and recreate the original salad there. Anyway, I digress. So anyway, Caroline Astor stuck it out with a bloody hotel next door for a few years, and then she decided to hell with it. And so she sold her place, and they made a deal with her nephew to build a hotel on her property too, that would connect up to that one. And that's they were going to call it the Waldorf Schermerhorn for her side of the family, but somebody talked her out of that. And that became the Astoria. So they had connecting doors, and she insisted that the design, even though it was cleverly built so that it looked like it had the same number of floors, technically there's one more floor on the Astoria side than the Waldorf, so she could take top billing. And it was designed theoretically that if they had another falling out, they could disconnect the doors and have them as separate operations. Yes, Davenport has a couch named after him. Yeah, well, I don't. That one is a separate thing. I think that's an independent thing from Louis Davenport. So the Shrimp Louis is his little baby. I think the Davenport couch is a different, probably a distant relative, but not Louis Davenport. Anyway, we're getting more history here than you would care about. It's bloody hot here in Spokane. My den is still at 86 degrees, which I would prefer it if it were a little bit cooler. Anyway, so we got the Waldorf Astoria, and this went on for many, many years. And then as things were shifting after World War I, costs of holding mansions in the city were starting to skyrocket, and property values were changing, and things were moving farther uptown. And the need to maybe build a new hotel came along, and a project came in that Al Smith was involved in, which was the Empire State Building. So they bought the Waldorf Astoria, they demolished it, and built the Empire State Building there in the period 29, 30, 31, I think. And the problem is, if you're attempting to have a compressed time frame, as young Earth creationists are, you're ultimately having things that took place over a long period of time all happening at once. So for those who are super geeks and remember that there in 1945, during an especially foggy day, I think it was a B-24 bomber slammed into the 80th some odd floor of the Empire State Building, and engines were falling down and fuel and all this kind of stuff. It clipped off an elevator, and the elevator rider actually fell with it, but survived. And it was a briefly exciting moment on the Empire State Building. Well, creationists, in their kaleidoscopic mess of what's all going on during the big slosh, are the equivalent of trying to have Caroline Astor holding her balls in her mansion before the Waldorf or Astoria was built, and having a terrible problem organizing the people that are coming in for her 400 party celebrations, because of all of these people stampeding into the hall to register at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And then suddenly everybody is positively shocked when suddenly there's the B-24 bomber slamming into the Empire State Building over their heads, and the debris of the engine falling outside and maybe burning up the carriages of the people trying to get into Astor Mansion. You see, you can't have all that happening at once. And that's ultimately the problem that we're getting into with the young Earth creationist model here, is they're trying to cram way too much together. You get into the same problem with the biogeography issue and all of that. So I always like to keep my mind focused on these matters of systematics and sequencing, and also pay close attention to any of the paleontology works that discuss these things in their own context, because every single bit on that scope is colliding with what's going on with the creationist cartoon. Jackson has now begun reading through my version of chapters 2 and 3 for the new book, and I will be getting his feedback in due course. And I'm nearing completion, putting in the sciencey material relating to his chapter on the origin of tetrapods and the whole Cambrian paleontology issue that pops up between the messes of David Menton and the messes of Steve Meyer and the messes of Gunter Beckley for his chapter 5. I still have to do the cosmology chapter. I've all got the notes on it downstairs, and that will be a fun little thing to deal with, because I always have to keep my focus on the fact that we want to present it in the context of how the creationists are weaving their way into, or usually around or far away from, the actual data field. Yes, it's difficult to cram hundreds of millions of years into less than 6K. You've got an inherent chronological problem that you have involved with that, and the scale aspect. And it's particularly fun in the human evolution field, not only in the fossil context, but once you start getting into the human evolution, human dispersal thing that is supposedly happening after the flood. I can't say that this particular ammo was something I did. Nope. It's, thank you, Dan Stern Cardinale, and we'll be alluding to them as proper credits in the book. But Nathaniel Jensen's attempts to compress the human evolution, human dispersal, genetic information that covers tens of thousands of years into the flood context and after, not only involves tweaking the radiocarbon scale so that he can crunch everything down, but also the genetic bits. Why weren't any of the plesiosaurs adapted to eating trilobites? Yes, indeed. That's another. You've got all of those critters that live in the watery habitat. The two groups that are consistently one of the biggest problems for creationism is marine creatures. What barriers were preventing whales and plesiosaurs from sliding into one another? And animals that can fly. So what barriers were preventing eagles and pterosaurs from landing on the same shrub before they meet their demise in the flood? This level of confusion, you get various ones. I think Michael Ord and a few others are trying to argue that I think Paul Price is some of these that have tried this, where they've got these sort of ecological zonations. I think Todd Wood is intrigued with that kind of thing. Garner, that's another one that pops up in my head on that, where they're thinking that they're kind of little enclaves of critters that are living just in it. But how does that work in the oceans? And you've got the invertebrates that are going along. One plucky little anomalocarid can't make it into the same deposit as a seal. And where exactly was anything living? So many of these little critters are popping up in the same geologic frame as a succession of stuff. You've got marine creatures that are living in one zone because it was seacoast, and much later in a seacoast of a different time. Why aren't they all together? Hi, hello, Lisa. So we've got, that's all part of the stratification issue. One thing that I think most critics of creationism have spotted is almost a dead duck. And if creationists use it, it's because they're riffing off of Henry Moore's era apologetics, which means they're probably reading hard copy books from that period, not internet stuff. So they're probably old farts like me. And that is the idea that the flood could sort the critters and have them land in the right context by just sorting by volume. But there's been way too many critics of creationism that have pointed out how that can't work. There's no indication that clams are sorted by size as you move up the column. And so this one is a non-starter. And the more active creationists in that kind of new creationist movement that you see coming along in this century have pretty much junked that. So as we move farther and farther on, we can see lots of creationist concepts evolving over time as some of their more busy fields have to discard the views that were held by the others. Now, if you have a petrified mind like a Kent Hovind, then you don't have to worry about that. You simply channel the 1990s creationism that you organized when you started to do videos, and it just stays stuck with very little interaction later. But what you do try to get at ICR and AIG and CMI is incorporating some of this newer stuff. And that's why you're starting to get allowing it's almost extinct, the idea that carnivory only arrived after the flood. That was an idea that Henry Morris was happy with and Duane Gish were happy with 30 years ago. And maybe in his wet dreams, Ken Ham would like to have that case too. He doesn't really delve into it a heck of a lot, but the ones that actually do the work are pretty much okay with this, that carnivory occurs because of Adam's sin, and that is occurring really before the flood. And that's why they can account for signs of predation in dinosaurs and various other critters that is just so extensive. We're alluding to it in one of the appendices for the new book so that you can see this evolutionary process that's been going on. Another thing that has been evolving over time is the plate tectonics issue. Those of us who can remember the old Henry Morris type stuff and Duane Gish, they didn't allow there to be any continental drift at all. They envisaged the pre-flood world as the perfectly created world that had mountain ranges on it, and Mount Ararat was ready for the Ark to land on it, and everything was just sweet and concise. But that is becoming increasingly untenable, to where virtually all modern creationists are talking about supercontinents prior to the current layout as the pre-flood thing. Some will go Pangaea as the pre-flood continent, whereas AIG's preference is for Rodinia, as I mentioned, and maybe something else. Now, of course, as we go farther back in time, then you've got Columbia and the ones even before then that are times before there's any terrestrial life on them. I think they tend not to do much on that front. Now, try to figure out how these plate systems could move and the forms could actually move around from one thing to another. That's going to get them into exactly the problem of the Astor Mansion, Waldorf Astoria, Empire State Building, because they're going to have too much happening too quickly. And that stumbles back onto the heat problem. Another thing that we'll be bringing up there, we'll be alluding to that magnificent video that Gutsick Gibbon did, compiling so many of the little examples on this. That none of this stuff is going to go away. And then, of course, you've got the Randy Guglielmo set at ICR trying to demolish natural selection. That has split the group. There's an awful lot of creationists are kind of okay with natural selection being a functional thing. Then you've got another ICR shibboleth, which Joel Duff has called attention to quite nicely, is that when did the flood end? And the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, which most young Earth creationists accept. Tim Clary and his little clique, and it's only about a dozen people orbiting Clary, want to amalgamate it and bring in the Cenozoic. And we've been alluding to that little aspect, and we'll have some commentaries on that in the new book as well. Now, there will probably be further elements. One theoretical possibility it involves how they're going to treat dinosaurs and birds. Is there not a logical temptation to drag? Well, there is the argument to try to keep feathered dinosaurs as birds and the non-feathered ones as separate. But boy, that's a systematic mess. It hasn't worked for non-creationist Alan Fiducia, as he's flip-flopped back and forth on critters as to whether or not they're flightless birds or dinosaurs solely on the basis of whether they find feathers on them. And he doesn't like cladistics and doesn't do systematics, and he's still the favored fellow to be channeled by creationists. And spoiler alert, he'll be popping up in the Sarfati and Tay book later on. They can't resist him because he's their only source that can really help them on this front. There are little sidebars. You've got some of the ones at the Smithsonian, Storrs Olson, and others that kind of orbit along that little sidebar. But boy, these are not the cutting edge of the field. And you've got the unavoidable necessity in ROX 1. Remember, we had a great big chart breaking down the taxa, some 30-some genera of theropods known directly by their fossils to have feathers. And the earliest ones are predating Archaeopteryx. So that whole temporal argument that Jonathan Wells tried to do in Icons of Evolution, and you still see channeled over and over again by people in the design movement, and those who kind of suck that up from the creationist stuff on the internet, don't they know that's a dead letter? Non-paleontologist Jonathan Wells hasn't got the clue, and non-paleontologist Casey Luskin apparently hasn't got the memo, but, you know, what the hell can they do? So it's a fascinating phenomenon to see them deck stack and cherry pick and evade on those issues, and on other ones. The big hobby horse, of course, at the intelligent design movement is to reject junk DNA. You get chunks of that in the young Earth creationist thing, but nobody jumps off the gangplank quite so spectacularly as Casey Luskin and that crowd, as we know in their interactions with Dan Stern Cardinale, and which, of course, is another chance to plug. Next week will be the next installment of the Casey Luskin file, where I'm going through source by source by source, eventually all 800 of the various papers that they are marshaling for their arguments that junk DNA is not a thing. Sorry, it's a thing. And Zach Hancock has weighed in as well. He's done just a magnificent historical treatise on where the concept came from and who was favoring it and who was disagreeing with it and all the rest, and why junk DNA is absolutely inevitable from the way we understand genetic systems operate. That it's preposterous to think that, you know, these retrotransposons that can inveigle themselves into the system, that they all have to be doing something. So our following along on this, my expectation is that there ain't going to be no smoking guns in that works. That the best they can do, yay, you can see again. The best they can do is one of the papers that we had noted in previous episodes is vague enough that you could be theoretically arguing that they were kind of thinking that lots of retrotransposons might be functional. Um, it was vague wording, and nothing in it explicitly was countering that argument. That's the most that they've got. One paper so far out of 20. And I'm anticipating, some of it duplicate copies that are necessarily sections. Yes, well, the Zach Hancock's video is just spectacular on this. He put in bills of material that I had aware of in terms of a lot of the history, the dramatis personae on this, how some of the older biologists didn't like the idea of junk DNA at all in principle. They were really, they were the adaptationist wing of evolution, the sorts that Stephen Jay Gould was often critical of over in his area. And I'm very much marinated in the Gould tradition of reading his various posts at Natural History, where he would be arguing that don't assume that everything in biology is functional or an adaptation, that there is a degree of just kludgy accidentalness and contingency and accident going on. And so I think had Gould lived farther into our own times, he would have had no problem burrowing his way through and writing snarky essays pointing out how people overstate the facts on these things. But Hancock has come in and done a splendid job of nitpicking the details perfectly. I think it's really quite delightful. And he brought in some newer material on how transposons function and the dynamic of them, and that I've added into my own reference field so we can all keep up on that. It's just absolutely delightful stuff. And we'll find out whether or not there's ever a rematch between Luskin and Dan on the Kellis paper that Dan was just itching to talk about, because he basically is arguing that the intelligent design movement is misrepresenting its contents. And I know he's wanting to go into this in some detail, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. Another one I'm not holding a breath on, and I've been alluding to it at various times, but I keep getting reminders of it as I'm researching through my data field. There's going to be a big section on whales. It's in a chapter that Jackson will be doing. But so I got a great big stack of material that are, I'm sure, a lot of material that Jackson will be bringing up, and other stuff maybe that he might not have known, and historical material of what creationists have been blathering on about it and all that stuff. So one of you ferreting, I'll be doing for that just as I'm doing on chapter 5 here. But one of the little dangling loose ends has to do with that damn Beckley paper on whale evolution, where they are arguing that they have disproven it, and it's going to come out just any minute now. Well, that's been years now, and I've seen absolutely nothing on it. I would love to see it. Even a badly written, incompetent paper would still be interesting to chew on, because it would be revealing as to their methodology, to see what sources they're relying on, how much of it is channeling Sternberg, because he's done these various videos. He's gone around the intelligent design lecture circuit going on and on about how whale evolution is way too fast. It can't possibly occur naturally, blah, blah, blah. But a video, I do videos. That's, I try to put my source material in so everyone can follow up. Sternberg doesn't do that. There's no source material in any of that material. So the advantage of it, even a paper in biocomplexity, or if they can find some little pet journal, and there are a few where they would be able to pay to play and get it that way. That's what Dan Stern Cardinale and when they first started unraveling, they were hoping for one-to-one. Oh, yeah, indeed, there was my conception of it, and Zach went in as well, is that they were assuming that there would be a clear connection between proteins and genes, at least, that one protein per gene. And they were quickly disabused of that. And with the discovery that was all churning along at this same time, that there was alternative splicing. And Zach covered it very nicely in his video about the lessons of things. So the old adaptationist paradigm of a nice, neat, tidy operation that Cavalier Smith and others were advocating started to disintegrate as they realized how much of the genome is contingent and accidental, and retrotransposons and alternative splicing to where multiple. a single gene can generate a bunch of different proteins depending on if it's read forwards or backwards. And a lot of that comes about because they're gene families. They're built from components that can do one thing if you take this part and something else over here to do that. And then, of course, you get the generators of novelty from the gene duplication part. And that's another bit about the onion test that Grauer had brought up. Jack goes into that as well, which is why do eukaryotes have widely varying genome sizes, even in closely related organisms? So why would a particular genus have 3, 4, 5 times as many genes as its close cousin? Why? Because they're gene duplications. And so that alters the bit. So you can't judge, air quotes, complexity just based on how big the genome is or how many nucleotides it is. You got to look more closely and figure out all of that. So, oh yes, everybody that's got troubles with their health and all of that, take care and get self straightened out on that. As I am in the old fart demographic, I'm trying to keep myself as fit as a fiddle as possible, because there are so many stupid people that I need to continue to annoy and write books about and learn the actual facts about, that I'm not anxious to give that up anytime soon. So we're talking decades. And plus I got to finish all the Paralogs novels. That's going to take some decades to do at the rate that I'm going, but at least I know where I'm going on the paths, and away we go. So anyway, there we're well past 40 minutes on that. Why do people, oh yes, why do some people have vestigial tails? Yeah. As it happens, Jackson Weed and I had a whole section on that in Rocks Were There Volume 1. We not only went into the genetics of how that comes about developmentally, but also some skewering points. David Menton, Casey Luskin, these are all people who have blither-blathered on that the vestigial tail thing's not real, it's not really vestigial tails, etc. No, bullpucky. And we burrowed through how they misrepresented sources and how they didn't seem to understand what the hell they were talking about. And it was quite a long section on it. Yeah, well, I will be 72 this year. And fortunately, I come from a fairly long-lived family, so I'm anticipating stuff there. To where if I live at least as long as my mom did, that's 96, and she had a bad heart, varicose veins, and skin ulcers. So I have none of those. So I don't see any reason why I can't shoot past 100. And that means I've got maybe about a good 30-year run left, maybe a little even more. We're in the 21st century, have much improved medical technology. Okay, yeah, still on the evolution book. Yeah, you'll find it in, you're still on the evolution slam dunk. Yeah, that's, I didn't discuss, I think I alluded to vestigial features a little bit in that, but Jackson had just a excellent baseline that we wanted to cover when we did this book, and then I folded in my material. And the vestigial tail matter turned out to be vastly more interesting than I had anticipated, because it really does reveal about the whole system. You've got two classes of things. You have these kind of fleshy extrusion things that are not really actually tail parts. They're some of the genes that are involved in making tails, but they can stick these things almost anywhere on the body. And they're kind of little sidebars. Much narrower and rarer are the actual tails with little bone parts. And Casey Luskin went out on a limb to actually deny that those sorts of things ever happen. Sorry, they do. They're very rare, but they do. And there was technical literature on this front. And in some cases, he could have found out about that had he looked at his own source base more clearly than he does. And that's why none of the people in the intelligent design movement impress me terribly for their meticulous scholarship. They are often very sloppy with things. I'm always looking at the telltale clues of these. More likely early 60s, something I better than average chance of breaking triple digits. Yeah, we got, plus never underestimate sense of humor and being stubborn. Oh, and speaking of not being stubborn, I need to remind everyone of our patrons, who, without which doing all of this would be much harder. And anybody that can join the parade of our colleagues or researchers or assistant researchers or friends, if you have a little bit of money to spare and you can plunk in for like $1 a month, if enough people do that, that all helps with the process. And it is enormously valuable in my peace of mind and the ability to continue on with the process, to have the reliability of knowing that X amount is coming in from Patreon, because I get a variable amount of material from the royalties on the books. It fluctuates all over the place by a month, but that stability of Patreon is extremely important to where I can go, that I should have that amount coming in. And so the more that can join that parade, if you've got a little spare, got to have it to spare. Just as Dapper Dino always points about the Patreons on his project, don't for a moment. Yes, I'd love to I donated in the 2020 campaign, but I haven't had enough scratch to knock around to be able to do it on this campaign. Although I do get little things on my smartphone, everything about it. But yeah, I've been really squeaky on material. There was a transformation in the supplies chain for fuels for the furnace that I've got to resort around and make sure that I get enough money to be able to put refill the tank before the wintertime and all that stuff. So as motivated as I would have been to contribute to the Biden campaign, alas and alack, I haven't been able to do that this year. I would love to get back to the point where I've got as much of a steady income that I can resume. I used to be a supporter for the local public radio and public broadcasting things back in the day when I was working at a regular job and had the paid health insurance and all that kind of stuff. But that's also been a squeaker issue. So anyway, we make do with what we can when we can. I've certainly been trying to be as much of an advocate as possible. And people much younger than me have been doing the same thing. Sisson, who's about, I think, 19 or 20. He's one of the examples of young people today who are explaining why it's so bloody important to be voting this November. And the rule that I use, and I comment on it constantly in the tweets and that I deal with, and to a certain extent here, is don't just focus on Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. You need to pay attention to anybody running for any office whatsoever to see whether or not they are falling in that Trumpista ideology framework. Are they enablers? Are they stealthy about it? And that means in my particular area, Washington state judges are typically nonpartisan. That doesn't mean they aren't ideologues. And so people, there's no party identification when they run for a judge, but you got to find out who they are. And there are several instances of where, no, I can't possibly vote for that person because they are, in fact, a stealth Trumpista ideologue. And the same thing for pay attention to who's going to go on school boards, who's going to go on city councils, what happens with state representatives, and all the rest. We're going to see Spokane is in kind of quirky little zone here. We're in a fairly conservative district, and yet quite a few of the representatives and the people running the city are often more liberal. We used to have a bigger diversity. We used to have Tom Foley and others in the Democratic Party, was Speaker of the House for a while. It's been a long time since that was the case. Kathy McMorris Rogers is retiring. And so it's kind of still up for grabs as to whether or not Democrats might be able to take that seat, which will all add collectively to the issue of who's going to control the House. And you need to pay very big attention to who controls the Senate. It's still very tight. The Democrats could lose the Senate if regardless of who wins at the top of the ticket. If Republicans regain control of the Senate, they can act as roadblocks for lots of appointments, both to the courts and to the various administrative areas. If Trump should win the presidency again, it would be cataclysmically bad if he also has the Senate there to act as a rubber stamp for actions. And the same thing with whoever controls the House. So you can't shut down the brain and just think, oh, gee whiz, it's only the person at the top of the ticket. So anyway, we are coming up on 50 minutes. Our signal has been running smoothly. Let me put my advert up for The Rocks Were There, which has that wonderful section on vestigial organs. It expanded like Topsy. It was really wonderful material. A spoiler bit, David Menton, the late David Menton, who died probably from COVID, Menton egregiously misrepresented a very old and really quite good book that discussed some vestigial organs, that it turns out every single claim Menton made about that book was wrong. And I was quite flabbergasted as to how good of a book it was for the 1890s. And we would only have been able to find that out because we were able to get access to the original book. It's a whole PDF from a thing from 1893. Oh, the blessings of the internet, where so much of stuff is available. Archive.org, praise be thy name. Oh, anyway, let me bring up my Rocks Were There advert. And there we go. Bring on pause there, and then back over and get our share screen. Get that up to speed, and away we go. And there we go. As always, every show, I put the direct links to all the books and to the Patreon. So anybody that wants to jump on the bandwagon in any of those ways can do so. I'm pleased to know the people that have been using The Rocks Were There as a kind of go-to resource because of how comprehensive it is. So Dapper Dino has used it that way. Dan Sturd Cardinale finally got a hard copy because he's drawing on it on so many topics. And Volume 2 will finish out the array, plus bringing in all that newer material that's occurred in the 4 years since the first book came out to bring us up to speed on that little front. And then there will be more books to come as we work on further projects down the line. Well, it's just wonderful. And does make an effective doorstop, yes, and it's big enough that weapon, that and there can be many functionalities on it. It's literally at the limit of how big of a book we could do through the CreateSpace thing at Amazon. That we had to scrunch down the font size and that on the reference notes and that to bring it below their maximum level. And cross fingers, we're hoping that the second book will be just about that same size, and we'll be able to squeak that in because there's an awful lot to bring up. That so many of the just gobsmackingly stupid things that creationists can continue to say on so many different topics, at getting fundamental issues wrong, making harebrained overstatements of things. And of course, we got the big slosh flood issue popping up and all of that. And the paleontology record keeps on changing. Just like today, I was putting in material. Jackson was bringing up the Hypothesize fossil. That's one from the Cambrian. Well, I was reminded, well, what about that it's different from Hycoella? Sounds very similar. And so and that relates to Unanozoan, I think, that otherwise we weren't mentioning. And so I've been putting a little reference notes in there that gives a little background on that thing so that if anybody, that no one will get confused on that particular point. And I'm the one that's responsible for doing the master indexing for the thing to make sure that, oh, wait a minute, we didn't mention that topic, that we can make sure that we get all of that sliced in. So we want to have the works as gobsmackingly comprehensive as possible, so that anyone who makes use of them will be on top of the creationist apologetics. Remember, this is not merely a compendium of the science information, as important and wonderful and interesting as that is, to get all that explained. And Jackson is just splendid as an explainer and getting the context of things and all of that. His mind works an awful lot the way mine did when I was his age, which is when a creationist makes a dumb thing, it will go through in order of their dumbness and demolish each one. And my benefit of being an old fart has tended to see the need to do things by thematic topic. So stuff that was all in that week, really, oh, that actually makes better sense to bring that all together as units, so that we're moving chronologically through a set of related thematic topic structures. And yeah, I have to say I have an awful lot of material with the number of sources that I have in there, tens of thousands of technical papers. I couldn't have hard copy on them anyway. But when it comes to books and that, even ones where I have PDFs of them, I'm always a little murky when I have to consult them, because I don't like dealing with that. One advantage that I've come about, my late brother, just before he passed on, because he was a big computer guy, he did testing for Microsoft as well. Anyway, he at one point allowed me to recycle my old high definition television that was just sitting downstairs, because I had gotten a gift of a newer one that was bigger. And the old one, 40-inch, works just fine as a monitor. And so he reconfigured my system so that I have a dual monitor system, which I know an awful lot of people who are really heavy into the bit do. And that means I've got a double set of screens, and that way I can have way more files open in a readable context, because you get to the point, if you're talking about even a standard monitor, you get to have so many little Windows things where you can lose track of the stuff as you're trying to flip back and forth from one to the other. And when you're trying to compare text in one PDF to text in another PDF, that is an awkward problem that is simplified if you have a bigger field to lay the stuff out of, as opposed to physical things where I can lay out the various papers or books and flip back and forth from one thing to another in a way to find out what I want to see. And as the books demonstrate, that you find out a hell of a lot of neat things about how people screw up. Yeah, well, that's another good way of doing it. Yes, there's wonderful advantages of the high definition format. So a lot of people that work directly off of just their one television set. I am a work in my den with my monitors here, and then when I'm wanting to watch TV, I'm out in the living room with the television set, and that's connected to my old Bose sound system that I collected over the years. So I've got kick butt 125 watt rear channel, which is not typically what one finds in a lot of systems these days, and it works out quite nicely. At any rate, alas, the one downside of that big 40-inch television set looming over me in the summertime is that there's a certain amount of heat coming off of the thing. And that's nice in the winter. It acts as like a big heat panel, but it contributes to the heat of the den during the summertime, and that's why it's been running around 85, 86 degrees in here, which is somewhat warmer than the rest of the house that runs off a little cooler that my niece's husband installed here last year to avoid me burning my brain out from the heat. At any rate, there are people who care about me and that I continue on. At any rate, once the video is finalized as usual, then we'll stick all the little sources in so that everybody can follow up. Nobody should ever have to take my word for it. No, we're living in the wonderful world of sources. And so you can research and study and connect up on your own, but I want to make everything available at least as possible. Yes, yeah, that the old CRTs plus the sheer weight. Holy moly, when we got that old high definition TV, the one that's now in front of me is my monitor, that bloody thing in 2006 cost $3,500, but trying to haul the old heavy television sets out, my God, those 35-inch monitors were just hellaciously heavy, and even the older style television sets had a mass to them. Our poor little cat back in the old days would never have made it into the modern world because the cat liked to sleep on top of the television sets, that there would be all that heat coming off the CRT tube, and it was just a wonderful little spot for old Dusty. But that wouldn't work on a modern television set because although they generate some heat, it's not nearly as much as all of that aspect. So anyway, it's always fun to see old movies like when you watch Blade Runner that was made in the 1980s and is set in 2019, and there are all these big CRTs that they have in the offices because they haven't quite figured out how to do flat screen apparently in 2019 in that show. Same thing with some of the stuff when they did 2010. That was the sequel to 2001. They didn't try to do remember. I more than just remember rabbit ears. The foible of Spokane is that some of the transmission towers are on Tower Mountain, which is on the south side of town, and one of them is up on Mount Spokane on the north side of town. And so no antenna you could get would point at both of those at the same time. And so one of the things that that we bought from Sears back when there was a Sears, it was called the Tenorotor. That it had a motorized antenna that you could rotate. So when you wanted to watch what eventually became KXLY up on Mount Spokane, you could rotate the antenna that direction. And then when you switch back over to CBS and PBS and ABC or NBC on Tower Mountain to the south, you could rotate the antenna. It's a quirky thing now with high definition where signals are either fully or not. And sometimes there will be foibles where the antenna was working just beautifully, and then suddenly they've got a little single problem. And I don't know whether or not it's quirky little bounces off of solar storms, or they lower the power wattage at night. There's all sorts of possibilities in that front anyway. But since I can remember the bad signals that we would have in the old days, and all of the ghosting and that you would get on stuff, I'm okay with the minor foibles of tuning in television on a high definition antenna. I don't have any of the stupid cables and stuff anymore. I'm not paying any money to any of that anymore, nor satellite. So it's just over the air, and we have really good systems here. Not one of our channels is owned by Sinclair, which is I've called attention to, is that bunch of ideologues that own a variety of media outlets around the country and have right-wing political propaganda that's masquerading as news. And that's the case for one of the big channels over in Seattle. None of the ones here in Spokane. Thank you very much. And we want to keep it that way. So anyway, we are actually past an hour. Evolution Hour is officially an hour. And everybody stay safe, stay cool. We still got heat domes here. The temperatures are still supposed to be in the 90s for the most of the week, and then cool a little bit better towards our kind of a normal kind of a thing. Yeah, we need a station from McKetter from Green Bay. Yeah. And we're kind of an interesting spot here. We've got a public broadcasting system that connects up with the Canadian stuff in Edmonton and Calgary, and that we have a very polyglot group of stuff here. So frankly, I think we have a better local set of media and local channels in terms of their investigative reporting and other stuff than way bigger Seattle over on the west side of the state. Anyway, okay, everybody stay safe and cool and comfortable, and we will continue with all the things that need to be discussed in subsequent episodes. So stay safe, and we are closing down the show. See you.